Hey everyone, welcome back.
Yeah, right.
We're diving deep today into something a lot of you might be thinking about, especially if you've ever, thought about working in another country. We're talking about Canada, eh?
Oh, Canada.
Yeah. Specifically, how some of the recent changes in their immigration policies could impact foreign workers. And we're really going to be focusing in on the Indian community this time.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, so our source today is a video we found from Canada Immigration. And let me tell you, some of these numbers they're talking about are pretty crazy. Like, get this, almost 5 million temporary permits are going to expire by the end of 2025.
Wow. 5 million, that's
That's a lot of people.
yeah.
Yeah,
Makes you think about, trying to build a life in another country when your
Wow.
status is temporary, right?
it's temporary, yeah. It's a big deal for a lot of people, for sure.
Absolutely. And you also have to think about the backlog in processing permanent residency applications. It's already a pretty long wait for a lot of people. So with all these permits expiring at the same time, the system could be overwhelmed, right?
Totally. So many people who need to adjust their status, and
Yeah.
it's going to be really difficult for a lot of people.
It's tough. Yeah.
So let's break down exactly what's changing here. The video talked about some pretty significant cuts to Canada's immigration targets.
Yeah, big cuts. The Trudeau government, they're planning to reduce that annual target for permanent residents. I think it was from 500,000 down to 395,000.
Wow.
Yeah, which is like, what, a 21% decrease?
That's a lot.
Yeah, it's pretty substantial. And it's not just the permanent residency, they're also looking at a reduction in temporary foreign worker intake, over 40%.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so, imagine you're a skilled professional, you've been working in Canada for years, contributing to their economy. Suddenly, that pathway to making it your permanent home, it's a lot narrower.
Yeah, that's a big deal for people.
Mm.
And they mentioned a decrease in international student intake, too, though not as dramatic.
Right, not as much.
So what is driving all these changes?
Well, the video explains that, Canada's facing some growing pains. Like, they've had this rapid population growth in recent years, which has put a strain on a lot of things. Housing, healthcare, infrastructure.
Yeah.
It's like, imagine a city built for a certain number of people and suddenly they have to accommodate way more.
Yeah.
Roads get congested, the schools are overcrowded, waiting times for healthcare, they increase. So basically the government's trying to hit the brakes a bit.
So trying to find a balance between attracting all this global talent, but also
Right.
making sure everyone in Canada is
Exactly.
doing okay.
Yeah, sustainable growth. Right.
Makes you wonder, though, if this is the right way to do it. Is it a necessary adjustment? Or is Canada shooting itself in the foot by limiting all these skilled workers?
That's the big question, isn't it? Like, on the one hand, they need to address the infrastructure, the housing, all that stuff. But on the other hand, cutting back on immigration could lead to labor shortages in some really key sectors.
Yeah.
Healthcare, tech, all those places that are already struggling to find workers. Like, imagine the strain on hospitals if they lose all these foreign-trained nurses.
It's interesting, though, because even though we're focusing on the Indian community here, obviously these changes affect everyone who wants to immigrate to Canada, right?
Absolutely. It adds a whole other layer of complexity to the situation.
For sure. So let's talk about how this specifically impacts the Indian community in Canada. The video mentioned that it comprises over 1.6 million people.
It's a huge community. And a lot of them, they hold really important roles in, sectors like engineering, technology, healthcare, science. They're really a part of Canadian society.
And if all those skilled workers choose to leave because of these stricter policies,
That could be a huge problem. Major labor shortages, and it could really hurt Canada's reputation as this welcoming destination for global talent.
the video actually painted a pretty bleak picture, using terms like mass departure,
Yeah.
talking about how individuals are going to be grappling with these changes. What do you think about that?
It's a powerful image. And while I don't know, how big the impact will actually be, it's clear that this is going to affect a lot of people's lives.
Right.
There's this one line in the video that I thought was really powerful. It said, the road ahead will likely be fraught with hurdles as individuals grapple with the complexities of changing regulations and requirements.
Wow.
It really gets at that uncertainty that people must be feeling right now.
Yeah. So for anyone listening who's either in Canada right now on a temporary permit, or maybe even just thinking about moving there, understanding these new policies, super important.
Absolutely. Your future might depend on it.
Now let's shift gears a little bit and think about the potential consequences of these new policies for individuals, A&E Canada as a whole.
It's not just the economic side of things, though, you know? These changes, they could have a ripple effect on Canada's social fabric, too. You got to think about the people you know, the human stories behind these statistics.
Totally. It's easy to just get lost in the numbers.
Exactly. Each one represents a person with hopes, with dreams. Imagine, like a skilled engineer from India who's been in Canada for years, working on a temporary permit. They've built a life there, maybe even started a family, and then suddenly that path to staying permanently, it gets a lot harder. What do? Do they just uproot their whole life, leave a place they've started to call home? That's a tough decision.
Yeah, it's hard to think about all those families who might be impacted by this. And the video even mentioned that it could lead to like a brain drain.
Right.
All these skilled professionals might just choose to go somewhere else.
Yeah.
But wouldn't a decrease in immigration actually mean less competition for jobs? So potentially that would benefit Canadian workers?
That's true. It is a valid point, yeah. It's a complicated thing with a lot of factors to consider. But even though some Canadian workers might benefit, the overall impact on the economy, it's debatable, right? Because Canada has relied on immigration to fuel its growth, especially in areas where they're already facing shortages. So losing a bunch of skilled workers could hurt them in the long run.
So it's not as simple as fewer immigrants equals more jobs.
Nope,
No.
not at all. And think about it beyond just the economy, like Canada's social and cultural fabric. Immigration has always been a part of their identity, right? Contributing to that diversity and vibrancy.
Yeah.
So these new policies, even though they're trying to fix these immediate problems, it could kind of be a shift away from that towards something a lot more restrictive.
And the video brings up another interesting point. It doesn't really criticize the government, but it asks some important questions about the long-term effects of all of this.
Yeah, like will these short-term solutions, to housing and infrastructure problems, will they backfire eventually? Because by limiting the flow of talent, Canada might fall behind globally in terms of innovation and economic growth.
So it's like this balancing act,
Exactly.
managing growth without stopping the things that have made Canada so successful.
Finding that sweet spot is hard. And we can't forget about the human side of it all, right? These changes could really impact individuals and families. Like I was talking to this young engineer from India the other day. He's been living in Canada for 5 years, and he was crushed when he heard about these new rules.
Oh,
He felt like everything he'd been working for was suddenly uncertain.
yeah, that's really tough. Really shows the human cost of all of this. So what stands out to you as the biggest takeaway from this deep dive?
For me, it's this contrast between Canada's image, right? This welcoming, inclusive nation, and then the reality of these policies. It makes you wonder, what kind of country does Canada want to be in the future?
Yeah, it definitely changes how people see Canada as a land of opportunity. And the video does a good job of showing just how complex this all is.
Absolutely. It makes you think.
For sure. So for anyone thinking about Canada as a place to live, you really need to understand what's going on. The rules have changed.
Yeah. What might have worked a few years ago might not work now. And for people already there on those temporary permits, staying informed and getting good advice is more important than ever.
Absolutely.
It's a tough situation, no doubt, but there are resources out there to help people.
Right.
Knowledge is power, as they say. In this case, it could be the difference between, being able to adapt to these new rules or facing some really big life-changing consequences. It's a wake-up call for all of us to pay attention and think about how these changes might affect us or the people we know.
So to wrap up this part of our deep dive, any final thoughts? It feels like we're watching a big shift in Canada's immigration story. And even though we've been talking about foreign workers, I keep thinking about how this affects Canadian society as a whole,
Yeah, that's an important point to consider. Because these policy shifts, they go way beyond just housing and infrastructure. They get to the core of what it means to be Canadian, you know what I mean?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like what happens to Canada's reputation as a multicultural nation if it gets a lot harder for people from different backgrounds to make it their home?
It's a good question. Canada's always been proud of its openness, that inclusivity, and that's helped them a lot, economically and culturally. So if these policies lead to fewer immigrants, it could have some really unexpected consequences for their society and for their place in the world.
What about on a personal level? Could we see more discrimination, xenophobia? If the narrative becomes all about how immigrants are straining resources, will that create a climate of fear? and make certain communities more vulnerable.
It's definitely a risk. We've seen it happen before throughout history. When the economy is uncertain, when there's social tension, minority groups often become scapegoats. So it's really important to keep talking about these things to understand each other.
So what does all this mean for our listeners? What are the key takeaways they should be thinking about?
The most important thing is to be aware and to think critically. We can't just sit back and let these changes happen without questioning them. We need to have conversations about what the consequences might be, both the good and the bad.
Exactly. We need to ask those tough questions, listen to different points of view, and hold our leaders accountable for their decisions. And for anyone directly affected by these changes, staying informed and getting advice from experts is really important.
Couldn't agree more. This whole deep dive has really shown how important it is to stay engaged with these issues. The immigration landscape is always changing, so we have to stay informed, think critically, and push for policies that reflect our values.
This has been a really thought-provoking conversation. Before we go, is there anything else you'd like to leave our listeners with? Something to think about as they navigate this changing landscape.
I think the most important thing is to remember that even with all these changes, there are still ways to immigrate to Canada. It might take more research, more planning, more resilience, but that dream of building a life in Canada, it's not necessarily gone. Stay informed, explore your options, and don't give up on your aspirations.
Well said. Thanks for joining us today for this deep dive into Canada's new immigration landscape. It's complex, it's always changing, and we encourage you to keep learning about it, keep asking questions, and form your own opinions. Until next time, stay curious.